Chapter 1. The Drowned Bride. The sea had been restless for days. From the moment Miss Marple arrived at the small seaside station, she felt it in the wind, that subtle unease that made the gulls wheel higher and the air taste faintly of iron and salt. The coast of Westbury-on-Sea was not the kind of place one visited for excitement. It was quiet, tucked away from the main lines, known for its half-empty boarding houses and a single long pier that reached like a finger into the grey wash of the channel. Yet to Miss Marple, it held that particular English charm, the melancholy beauty of decay, of things that had once been grand and were now content to fade gently into memory. She had come at the invitation of an old acquaintance, Mrs. Amelia Fenchurch, who, according to her letter, had a small matter of domestic unease at her estate by the water. Miss Marple had read the phrasing twice, smiled softly, and packed her knitting. Domestic unease, in her experience, often concealed more than it declared. The taxi carried her through narrow lanes rimmed with hawthorn, past cottages with flaking whitewash and gardens overgrown with rosemary. Then the view opened suddenly to the sea, a wide, heaving expanse the color of tarnished silver. On a bluff above the bay stood the house itself, Winlow Grange, an Edwardian relic of sand-colored stone and dark slate roofs, its windows staring blankly toward the south. The driver, a young man with the look of one who wished he were anywhere else, slowed as the wind pressed against the cab. "They say the house is haunted," he offered with a nervous chuckle. Miss Marple's eyes, pale and steady, remained on the sea. "Most houses are," she said gently, "if not by ghosts, then by the people who lived in them." He said no more. Inside, the house smelled faintly of salt and camphor. Mrs. Fenchurch greeted her with an enthusiasm that seemed rehearsed, a tall, thin woman whose beauty had withered but not vanished, much like the roses that clung stubbornly to the trellis outside. She led Miss Marple through a hall lined with portraits, their eyes watching like sentinels. "I can't think what's come over the place," she said, her voice tight. "Doors left open, things moved, and, oh, perhaps it's only my imagination, but I've felt someone about even when I'm quite alone." Miss Marple listened, nodding, her fingers folded neatly around her handbag. She noticed the cracked mirror in the corner, the vase of dead hydrangeas, and a single muddy footprint leading toward the servants' staircase. Details, always details. That night, the wind rose until it moaned around the chimneys. The tide swelled and broke with the sound of something ancient and hungry. Miss Marple sat by a small fire in the guest room, knitting steadily, counting stitches in her mind. Below, a door banged. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the faint echo of weeping, or perhaps it was only the wind along the cliffs. At dawn, a scream tore through the house. By the time Miss Marple reached the shore path, villagers had already gathered. The body had washed up against the rocks. A young woman, pale as sea foam, her wedding gown tangled with seaweed like a shroud. The sight silenced even the gulls. Someone whispered the name, Eleanor Vane, married only 2 days before, gone missing after the wedding breakfast. Miss Marple stood apart from the murmuring crowd, her eyes tracing the details, the bruising along the wrist, the ring finger bare, the faint cut beneath the hairline. She said nothing. The sea said enough for both of them. The constable, red-faced and clearly out of his depth, declared it a dreadful accident. Miss Marple, however, knew that accidents seldom wore silk and lace. She lingered as the tide began to retreat, and something glinted near the rocks, a silver hairpin shaped like a lily. She stooped, slipped it into her pocket, and turned back toward Winlow Grange. At breakfast, Mrs. Fenchurch's hands shook as she poured the tea. "Such a tragedy," she murmured. "Poor child. They say she was radiant that day." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Radiance often precedes ruin." She took her tea unsweetened and looked toward the sea through the rain-streaked window. The waves had already begun to erase the footprints on the shore. Later that morning, the groom, Mr. Thomas Vane, returned to the house, his face hollow with shock. The local doctor had identified his wife, confirmed the drowning, and left him to his grief. Yet Miss Marple noticed how the man's eyes avoided the windows, how his hands bore scratches not made by rope or rock. Grief, she thought, is seldom tidy. By evening, the village had begun to gossip. The sea had always claimed lives, but not brides, not on their honeymoon. Some whispered that Eleanor had thrown herself into the surf, others that she'd been lured there, In every voice, Miss Marple heard the familiar cadence of human need, the desire to explain the unexplainable, to soften guilt with rumor. She walked the cliffs alone as dusk fell. The wind pressed against her hat, carrying the distant clang of a buoy bell. Below, the water turned black with the coming night. She paused where the path bent sharply toward the rocks and knelt. There, half buried in mud, lay a fragment of lace, torn, deliberate. The edges were frayed not by the sea but by force. Not the sea, she murmured, but hands. She turned the lace in her palm and thought of Mrs. Fenchurch's unease, of the young groom's silence, of the letter that had summoned her here. Patterns forming, threads intertwining, as they always did. Back at the house, the storm came again. The windows rattled. The servants moved like ghosts through the corridors. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, the knitting idle in her lap. She studied the portraits on the wall, generations of Fenchurches staring down with painted calm. In one, she noticed the same silver hairpin the drowned bride had worn. Family heirloom, Mrs. Fenchurch explained when Miss Marple asked. Passed from mother to daughter. I gave it to Eleanor as a something borrowed. She must have worn it when her voice faltered. Yes, Miss Marple said gently, when she went to the sea. The older woman's eyes filled with tears. I never thought she would. She was so full of life. Miss Marple reached out, resting her hand lightly on Mrs. Fenchurch's arm. Life, my dear, is often where death begins its work. Outside, the tide withdrew again, pulling secrets with it. That night, Miss Marple could not sleep. The house creaked like a ship in distress. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed. She rose, wrapped her shawl, and followed the sound. The corridor smelled of salt and candle wax. In the study, she found the window ajar, rain spattering the desk. A drawer hung open. Within lay a ledger, pages of accounts, neat but inconsistent. At the bottom, a single line scrawled in haste. Insurance policy, Eleanor Vane, effective June 4th. She closed the drawer quietly. When morning came, the village constable called again to offer his condolences. Miss Marple accompanied him to the quay where the fishermen had found the body. The tide was lower now, revealing more of the rocks. She noticed a trail of crushed shells leading not from the sea but from the headland part above, the direction of the Fenchurch property. Strange currents here, the constable remarked. They pull in all sorts. Yes, said Miss Marple, her gaze steady. They do. The following morning broke with a thin, milky sunlight, the kind that seems to shine only halfway, unwilling to fully chase away the night. A mist still hung over the beach at Tidecombe, blurring the horizon into a soft grey haze where the sea met the sky. Gulls wheeled silently, as if their cries, too, had been muffled by the fog. Miss Marple stood upon the narrow promenade, her sensible hat pulled low against the sea breeze. In her gloved hand, she held a folded copy of the Tidecombe Chronicle, and there, on the front page, was the name of the drowned woman, Lydia Harcourt, 26 years old, engaged to be married, found floating face down in the shallows beneath the cliffs. Cause of death, accidental drowning, said the coroner. But Miss Marple, who had seen too many such accidents before, merely pursed her lips. Oh, dear me, she murmured softly, her eyes tracing the inked words. When young women drown, particularly before a wedding, one does rather begin to wonder. Behind her, the seaside. Somewhere, far down the beach, a fisherman's bell rang faintly through the fog. She walked slowly toward the village, her eyes scanning every detail. The damp scent of salt and decay, the peeling paint on the guest houses, the silence of the few villagers already about their errands. Tidecombe had a beauty, yes, but the sort of beauty that comes from neglect, faded postcards and weathered souls. At the corner of the high street stood the Blue Gull Inn, its curtains drawn against the light. It was said that Lydia Harcourt and her fiancé had dined there the night before her death. Miss Marple decided it was as good a place as any to begin. Inside, the air was close, beer, smoke, and the faint tang of brine. A portly landlord looked up from polishing a glass, his expression curious but not unfriendly. Morning. Bit early for lunch. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Oh, no, my good man. I was merely curious. I believe a young lady, Miss Lydia Harcourt, was here not long ago. The man's hand froze mid-polish. Aye, that'd be last Thursday night. Sad business. That. Poor girl. She was engaged, I understand. That's right, to a chap named Geoffrey Leon. Stayed up at Harcourt House. They did. Her family's summer place. Beautiful view of the sea. Dangerous, though, them cliffs. Miss Marple nodded faintly. Yes, so I've heard. Her gaze drifted to the wall, where a photograph hung slightly askew, a faded seaside view of Tidecombe, taken years ago. In it, a small figure stood on the edge of the cliff path, too far to see clearly. But somehow there was something chilling in the stance. A woman, perhaps, watching the sea. Voice lowers, slower, suspense thickens. Miss Marple had always trusted in one thing above all, human nature. You could dress it up, disguise it, educate it, refine it, but beneath the manners and lace and polite conversation, the same impulses always ruled. Love, lust, greed, fear, the trinity of tragedy. She had seen them all at work in St. Mary Mead, in the baker's quarrel with his wife, the colonel's accidental fall from his horse, even the churchwarden's mysterious generosity after his aunt's death. And so she did not believe for a moment that Lydia Harcourt had simply wandered too close to the edge. It was, as always, the small things that betrayed the truth. The next day, Miss Marple called upon Harcourt House. It was a grand old place on the hill, overlooking the sea, its windows glinting like cold eyes in the morning light. There she met Geoffrey Leon, the fiancé, handsome, well-spoken, but pale and taut, like a man carved from grief. I can't think how it happened, Miss Marple, he said, voice trembling. She loved the sea. She was always out walking by the cliffs, sketching. But she wouldn't have gone too close, not Lydia. Indeed, said Miss Marple softly, her knitting needles clicking faintly as she Saturday, and you were to be married soon. Next month, he said, and his face twisted. Everything was ready. The dress, the church, the invitations. She'd been a little anxious of late, but I thought it was only nerves. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Anxious, you say? He nodded. Yes. She'd been receiving letters, upsetting ones. She wouldn't tell me who from, only that it was a mistake from the past. But I swear, I'd never seen her so frightened. Letters, Miss Marple repeated softly. I see. That evening, when Miss Marple returned to her boarding room at Mrs. Finch's guest house, she found the fog thicker than ever. The village streetlights glowed like lanterns under water. Somewhere, a dog barked, and the sea groaned against the pier. She lit a small lamp by her window and gazed out toward the dark line of the cliffs. For a moment, she imagined Lydia Harcourt walking there, her veil whipping in the wind, her footsteps uncertain, her mind full of something she could not confess. And behind her, perhaps, the faint crunch of another pair of footsteps. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. It's always the same, she whispered. When one fears exposure, one seeks silence. The following day brought a new clue, small, but telling. A fisherman had found a torn piece of lace tangled in the rocks below the cliffs, near the place where Lydia's body had been discovered. The police thought little of it, but Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. The lace was not from a gown or veil. It was from a handkerchief, delicately embroidered with the initials E.L. E.L., Miss Marple murmured, tracing the letters. Not Lydia Harcourt, but perhaps Eleanor Leon. It was a guess, but one that fit too neatly to ignore. Geoffrey Leon had a sister, Eleanor, unmarried, living with him at Harcourt House. Miss Marple had seen her once at the grocer's, tall, sharp-featured, with eyes like blue ice, the sort of woman who could smile while quietly despising you. And so, the next afternoon, Miss Marple called again. Eleanor Leon received her stiffly in the drawing-room, dressed in black silk though the mourning period had barely begun. "I suppose you've come to ask questions," she said coldly. "Oh, not at all," said Miss Marple pleasantly, taking a seat. "I've merely come to offer my condolences. Such a dreadful thing to lose a friend." "We weren't friends," Eleanor said shortly. Lydia was pleasant enough, but not suited to Geoffrey. She came from money, but no breeding. You understand?" "Quite," said Miss Marple, her needles moving softly. "Still, I imagine you'll miss a presence in the house." Eleanor's lips thinned. "On the contrary, I prefer peace." For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the faint tick of the mantel clock. Then Miss Marple said gently, "You know, Miss Lyon, it's a curious thing how a person's character often reveals itself in little ways. In how one speaks of the dead, for instance." Eleanor's face hardened. "Are you implying something?" "Not at all," said Miss Marple mildly. "But I do wonder if Lydia's death was not quite as accidental as it seemed." Eleanor rose abruptly. "That's preposterous." "Is it?" Miss Marple looked up, her eyes kind but piercing. "Because you see, I believe Lydia Harcourt was afraid of someone, and that fear, Miss Lyon, was very near indeed." Outside, the sea had begun to rise, the waves crashing harder against the rocks, the wind moaning through the gullies. It was as if the coast itself had begun to protest, to murmur secrets long buried beneath the tide. Miss Marple walked the cliff path alone that evening, her shoes crunching softly on the gravel. She paused at the edge, looking down at the restless water below. And there, half buried in the damp earth, she saw something glinting faintly, a small silver locket. She picked it up carefully. Inside was a photograph, faded but unmistakable. Lydia Harcourt and Geoffrey Lyon. They were smiling, but behind them, just at the edge of the frame, stood another figure, a woman, blurred but unmistakably watching. Eleanor Lyon. Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. "Oh, my dear," she murmured to the sea. "You were right to be afraid." She returned to her room and wrote a letter, not to the police, but to an old friend, Inspector Craddock. "Do come at once," she wrote. "I fear our seaside calm hides something far darker than mere accident. There is jealousy here, and perhaps a touch of madness." And as the storm rose at night, lashing the windows with salt and wind, Miss Marple sat quietly by her lamp, knitting a long, grey scarf. Her needles moved in soft rhythm, click, 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 like the pulse of time itself. Outside, thunder rolled across the sea, and the waves crashed higher still. By morning, something, or someone, would break. Chapter 2. The Storm at Harcourt House. The storm had come in from the Atlantic with no mercy. By dusk, Tidecombe was swallowed whole, the sky a dark bruise above the sea, the rain slashing sideways against the windows, the cliffs echoing with the roar of the wind. It was not a night for the living to walk abroad. And yet, somewhere along the coastal path, a lone figure pressed forward through the gale, small, stooped, wrapped in a sensible grey coat. Miss Marple. Her umbrella had turned inside out 3 times before she gave up the battle. Now she simply leaned into the storm, her step steady, her eyes fixed on the faint, golden glow of Harcourt House ahead, that grand, crumbling mansion staring out over the Black Sea. She had come with a purpose, and that purpose was truth. Inside, the house was alive with the sound of wind moaning through the chimneys. Lightning flashed across the drawing-room, briefly illuminating portraits of solemn ancestors with cold, accusing eyes. Geoffrey Lyon was there, pacing before the fireplace. His hands shook as he poured a measure of whiskey, not from fear, one might think, but from something darker. Guilt has its own tremor. Eleanor sat near the window, her face pale in the firelight. Outside, the rain streaked down the glass like tears. When Miss Marple entered, both turned sharply, and for a moment the silence was complete save for the thunder rolling beyond the cliffs. "Miss Marple!" Geoffrey exclaimed. "Surely you haven't come out in this." "Oh, dear me, yes," she said calmly, removing her gloves. "A little rain never hurt anyone, though I dare say it has drowned more than one secret." Eleanor gave a brittle laugh. "You do have a dramatic turn of phrase for a spinster, Miss Marple." "Only when the circumstances require it," she said. "And tonight, I believe, they most certainly do." Voice drops lower, slower, building tension. Miss Marple took a seat by the fire and folded her hands neatly in her lap. "You see," she began gently, "I've been thinking about Lydia Harcourt, about what might have brought her out to the cliffs that night. And I cannot help but conclude she did not go there alone. Eleanor's eyes flashed. You're implying someone led her there. Oh, I wouldn't presume to know just yet, Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. But people rarely wander to their deaths without purpose. And Lydia, poor girl, had too much to live for. A wedding, a home, a future. Geoffrey's voice broke. Then what are you suggesting? That someone pushed her? Miss Marple looked into the fire. I am suggesting, she said quietly, that someone wanted her silence and found the sea most convenient. A log cracked in the grate. The thunder drew nearer. Eleanor rose abruptly, her silk dress whispering as she crossed the room. This is ridiculous. The coroner ruled it an accident. Lydia was always dramatic, always emotional. Perhaps she took her own life. People like her often do. Miss Marple tilted her head. And why would you think that, my dear? Eleanor's mouth tightened. Because she was weak. There it was, the first truth, sharp as a knife. Miss Marple smiled softly. It's curious. I've always found that those who call others weak are often rather afraid themselves. Eleanor's gaze turned icy. Afraid of what? Oh, of being discovered, Miss Marple said mildly. Of being second best. Of losing something or someone they believe is rightfully theirs. Lightning flashed again, blinding white. Geoffrey turned away from both women, his glass trembling in his hand. Stop it, he said hoarsely. Both of you. Music swells, deep, stormy strings. But Miss Marple was not the sort to stop. Truth, once glimpsed, drew her onward like the beam of a lighthouse through fog. Mr. Leon, she said softly, when Lydia died, were you truly alone that evening? He looked up sharply. Of course I was. Ah, then perhaps you can explain, she said, her eyes bright as candlelight, why your sister's handkerchief, with the initials E.L., was found tangled in the rocks below the cliff. For a heartbeat, only the rain answered. Then Eleanor's voice came, low and fierce. That proves nothing. I walk those cliffs every morning. Indeed you do, Miss Marple replied. But not that night. That night, I think, you followed Lydia. Eleanor's chair scraped across the floor. You have no idea what you're talking about. Miss Marple remained perfectly still. On the contrary, you see, I believe Lydia discovered something she wasn't meant to know. Something about your brother. About the money, perhaps. Geoffrey's face went white. Money. Oh, yes, said Miss Marple quietly. Lydia's inheritance, a considerable sum, I understand, was to be transferred upon her marriage. You, Mr. Leon, stood to gain a great deal by that union. Geoffrey stared at her, aghast. Are you accusing me now? No, said Miss Marple softly. I am merely stating the mathematics of human temptation. The thunder broke directly overhead, shaking the windows. A portrait fell from the wall with a crash, its glass splintering across the carpet. The three of them froze, the fire flaring bright against their pale faces. Then Miss Marple's voice came again, softer than before. Lydia was not killed for love. She was killed for what love promised: money, possession, security. And the sea, my days, hides such motives very neatly until it decides to give them back. Eleanor's composure cracked. You old witch, she hissed. You think you can come here and ruin us with your gossip and your knitting and your... But she stopped herself, because in that moment, Geoffrey turned, his eyes wild with something that was not anger but terror. Eleanor, he whispered, what did you do? Her face drained of color. Geoffrey, no. What did you do? And suddenly, the storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside the room. Sound design suggestion. The storm peaks, thunder continuous. Eleanor took a step back, her voice trembling. It was an accident. She said she was leaving you, Geoffrey, that she'd found out everything. The debt, the lies, the forged signature on Father's estate. I tried to stop her from ruining you. I swear I did. But she turned. She slipped. Miss Marple rose slowly. Slipped? She repeated. Or was she pushed? Eleanor's hands went to her face. I didn't mean to. She fell. And I watched her fall. Her voice broke into sobs, the confession swallowed by the crash of thunder. Geoffrey stood frozen, the whiskey glass falling from his hand. "Dear God," he whispered. "Eleanor, what have you done?" "She would have destroyed you," Eleanor sobbed. "Everything you've worked for. I did it for you." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice remained steady. "People do dreadful things in the name of love," she said quietly. "And worse still, in the name of loyalty." At that, Eleanor turned to her, wild, tear-streaked, desperate. "You'll destroy us both, won't you? You'll tell them." Miss Marple looked into the fire once more. "The truth," she said, "tends to tell itself, my dear. The storm will pass, and with daylight comes clarity. You cannot hide guilt from the morning tide." And as she spoke, lightning split the sky, a final, brilliant flash illuminating the room in white. The roar of the sea rose up, mingling with the wind, and for a moment it seemed as though the whole of Harcourt House shuddered in grief. When morning came, the storm was gone. The sea lay calm again, deceptively so, its waves soft against the shore. A constable stood by the gate, speaking quietly with Inspector Craddock, who had arrived before dawn. Inside, Eleanor Leon sat motionless in an armchair, her eyes empty, her confession complete. Geoffrey sat beside her, pale and broken, staring into nothing, and Miss Marple, seated near the window, looked out at the horizon, the sun rising faintly through the mist. She thought of Lydia Harcourt, young, lovely, trusting, and of how easily the purest hearts undone by the envy of others. In the end, she reflected, love can be the coolest motive of all. Voice grows quieter, more reflective. "There's always a storm," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. "In every village, every heart. The trick, I suppose, is knowing when the tide will turn, and whom it will take with it." She gathered her knitting and rose. Behind her, the house creaked softly in the wind, like an old soul sighing in its sleep. The sea outside glimmered, innocent once more, as if it had not swallowed a bride, nor kept her secret beneath its waves. Chapter 3. Echoes in the Water. A cinematic voiceover script. Pure narration, heavy tone, slow rhythm, and deeply emotional resonance. Setting: the English seaside village of Tidecombe, the morning after the storm. Voiceover: low, atmospheric, as if spoken over the faint murmur of waves. Morning broke gently over Tidecombe, as though the village itself were afraid to wake. The storm had spent itself in the night, leaving behind a fragile calm, a silence so deep it felt unnatural. The streets were slick with rainwater, the roofs glistening like fish scales beneath the first hesitant light. Miss Marple rose early. She always did, though on this morning her movements were slower, her thoughts heavier. The previous night storm had not only torn at the coastline, it had torn away the thin fabric of deceit that wrapped around Harcourt House. A confession had been made, a life had been lost, and yet something still felt unfinished. For Miss Marple knew that confessions, like storms, rarely end neatly. They leave debris behind. She made her way along the promenade, her steps careful on the wet cobblestones. The sea lay calm again, pale and endless, but she did not trust it. The sea never told the whole truth. It simply kept what it pleased and returned the rest. Down by the pier, a small crowd had gathered, fishermen, villagers, a few curious onlookers. Something had washed ashore with the tide. Miss Marple drew closer. Two constables stood by a covered shape upon the sand, the canvas soaked dark with seawater. Inspector Craddock knelt beside it, his hat in his hand. He looked up as she approached. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I thought you'd want to see this." Beneath the canvas lay a wooden chest, the kind used for storing personal belongings. Its brass hinges were green with salt, its corners splintered. Craddock had pried it open carefully. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were letters, dozens of them. Miss Marple bent slightly, her keen eyes scanning the topmost one. The handwriting was neat, elegant, unmistakably Lydia Harcourt's. Voice slows, softens. "Dear Geoffrey," the letter began, "I know now what you have done. I cannot go through with the wedding. I shall go to the authorities tomorrow unless you come clean to me tonight. There must be no more lies. Miss Marple straightened, her voice quiet. She did know. Craddock nodded grimly. And it seems her letter never reached him. The tide must have taken the chest from her studio. We found it lodged among the rocks at dawn. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the chest. The sea does so hate secrets, Inspector. It always brings them back. Later that morning, she returned to Harcourt House. The great old mansion seemed smaller now, diminished somehow. The blinds were drawn, the whole silent except for the slow ticking of a clock. Eleanor Leon was under guard in the study, her face pale but strangely calm. Geoffrey sat beside her, staring at his hands. Miss Marple entered quietly, her presence as gentle as ever. "Good morning," she said softly. "I hope you both slept a little." Eleanor gave a faint, humorless smile. "I didn't sleep. I saw her every time I closed my eyes." Geoffrey looked up, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know what she'd done. I swear it." "I believe you," Miss Marple said kindly. "But belief, I'm afraid, is poor currency with the law." He nodded slowly, hollow-eyed. Miss Marple's gaze fell to the window. Outside, the sunlight danced faintly on the waves. "The sea," she murmured, "has an odd way of washing away guilt and yet leaving the stains behind." Voiceover deepens, melancholy but resolute. There was, however, one thing Miss Marple could not quite leave alone, the matter of the forged estate papers. That night, as the village settled into uneasy quiet, she sat by a lamp in the boarding house and reviewed what she knew. Lydia had discovered the forgery. Eleanor had confronted her, supposedly to protect her brother. But what if there was something more? She took out her notebook, small, leather-bound, and filled with neat handwriting. She began to jot down dates, names, and figures from her conversations. Geoffrey's father had died 2 years prior. The estate was in debt. The house nearly sold. Then, suddenly, funds appeared, enough to preserve Harcourt House, enough to pay the servants, enough to live comfortably again. And that money, Miss Marple recalled, had come from Lydia's inheritance, or rather, from a loan Lydia's solicitor had authorized under Geoffrey's name. A forgery, yes, but who had forged it? Geoffrey? Oh, someone else? The next morning, she called on Inspector Craddock again. "Inspector," she said briskly, "I should like to see the signature on the forged document, if you please." He raised an eyebrow. "You think there's more to it?" "I know there is," she said simply. Craddock produced the papers from his case. Miss Marple examined the signature, long, elegant loops, delicate pressure. Then she smiled faintly. "Oh, dear me," she murmured. "That's not a man's hand, Inspector. That's a woman's. Look at the curve of the L, the hesitation at the tail of the Y. A woman forged that signature." Craddock frowned. "Then Eleanor." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "She not only killed Lydia to protect her brother, she forged a debt to control him. Her love was never protection, Inspector. It was possession." Craddock stared at her, the realization sinking in. God help her. Miss Marple sighed gently. "Oh, I dare say God will. But justice must do its part first." That evening, the constables took Eleanor Leon away. She did not resist. Her expression was oddly serene, like one who has finally stepped out of a storm into still air, no matter how bitter. Geoffrey watched in silence, his hands clasped. When they were gone, he turned to Miss Marple. "What happens now?" "You'll tell the truth, Mr. Leon," she said softly. "The whole of it. That's the only way to begin again." He nodded faintly. "Do you think she meant to kill her?" Miss Marple looked out toward the sea, where dusk was falling in shades of blue and violet. "In my experience," she said quietly, "most killers never mean to. They simply mean to win, and discover, too late, that victory and ruin often share a bed." Voice drops to near whisper. As night fell over Tidecombe, the waves lapped gently against the shore. The tide had receded, leaving the sand smooth and clean. But somewhere beneath that calm surface, the current still toned, dark and deep, whispering of what they had taken, and what they had given back. Miss Marple stood alone by the water's edge, her coat drawn tight against the wind. In her hands, she held a single white flower, a piece of sea campion, plucked from the cliffs above. She let it fall into the tide. The sea took it without a sound. "There is something about the sea," she said softly, almost to herself. "It teaches one humility. No matter how deep we bury our sins, it will find them in the end. Every wave carries an echo of the truth." She turned from the water, her figure small and steady against the vastness of the sky. The evening light caught her silver hair, and for a moment she seemed like part of the landscape itself, ancient, enduring, quietly unyielding. She walked back toward the village, her footsteps fading into the hush of twilight. Behind her, the sea whispered once more, low, eternal, and indifferent. Chapter 4. The Widow's Lantern. The storm had passed, but it had left behind a silence so complete it seemed to hum. The sea lay restless, breathing in long, uneven sighs against the shingle. Along the coast, the gulls had vanished, and the only movement came from a tattered curtain flapping at a window of Seabourne House. Miss Marple stood upon the cliff path, her coat drawn tightly at the neck, the salt wind pressing against her cheeks. The storm had broken something in the air, something invisible but vital. The village below, Seacrest-on-Wyvern, felt smaller now, its narrow streets slick with rain, its chimneys still steaming from damp fires. And in her heart, Miss Marple knew that the sea had not taken all it meant to. She made her way down the path, the ground soft beneath her shoes, the heather slick and blackened with rain. At the base of the cliff, near the hollow where the tide curled and whispered, a lantern flickered weakly. It swung from an iron hook, the glass cracked but still burning. Someone had left it there during the night. A widow's lantern. In old seafaring superstition, widows kept a lantern burning on storm nights, a plea to the wave to return their men. But this one, Miss Marple thought, had been left not as a prayer, but as a warning. At the Fisherman's Quay, the village had gathered to survey what the sea had given back. Among the driftwood and kelp lay a broken rowboat, its name half-scraped from the hull, Eleanor. Inspector Latham was there, his coat collar up, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. He greeted Miss Marple with a nod that was more weary respect than courtesy. "The sea's been busy," he said quietly. "Dragged up half a past, it seems." "So it often does," Miss Marple murmured. "The sea never forgets. It merely waits until the living are ready to remember." Latham gave her a curious look. "You speak as if the tide has a conscience." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps it does, or perhaps it only reflects ours." He led her toward the wreck. There, caught in the splintered boards, hung a length of fabric, silk, torn, once white. Miss Marple touched it lightly with her gloved hand. A wedding veil. She turned toward the cliffs, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The sea is telling us where to look. Inspector." Back at Seabourne House, the air smelled faintly of salt and something else, something metallic, old. The housekeeper, Mrs. Corbett, had returned to tidy after the storm, though her movements were slow and uneasy. "Terrible night," she said, wringing her hands. Things fell from the walls, windows blown open, and in the cellar, water everywhere. "The cellar?" Miss Marple asked gently. "That's beneath the conservatory, isn't it?" "Yes. I should like to see it." Mrs. Corbett hesitated. "It's a dreadful mess. The master, well, Mr. Carruthers said no one was to." "Mr. Carruthers has gone," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "And Miss Gresham has gone longer still. I believe the cellar will keep no more secret from us." The woman gave a reluctant nod and led her down the narrow stair. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the smell of brine and rot. Water pooled to the edges of the stone floor, reflecting the weak light from above. And there, near a beam that had fallen during the night, lay a rusted tin box, its lid half open. Inside, Miss Marple found letters. Dozens of them. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but she could still read the first words clearly enough. "My dearest Eleanor." She unfolded one and began to read, her voice no louder than a whisper. "My dearest Eleanor, you must trust me. The money is nearly ours. Once your mother's affairs are settled, we'll go abroad as we planned. No one will suspect a thing. Your fiancé's fortune is nothing compared to what I've found here." Miss Marple paused. The handwriting was masculine, bold, but not Carruthers. She knew that hand. She had seen it once before, on a shipping manifest at the harbor office. Mr. Palfrey, the caretaker. Her eyes flicked up to the shadows. The cellar felt suddenly smaller. She folded the letter, tucking it neatly back into the box. "Greed," she murmured, "and love, or what men call it, when they mean possession." She replaced the box where it lay and straightened. The beam above her creaked. Somewhere above, a door closed. By dusk, the storm had given way to a fog so thick it seemed to erase the horizon. Miss Marple walked the lane toward the churchyard, her lantern held low, the glass misting from her breath. She stopped near Eleanor Gresham's grave. The soil was still fresh, the flowers wilted by rain. But there, beside the headstone, someone had left another lantern, smaller, newly lit, the flame steady and deliberate. A widow's lantern again, and tied to its handle was a ribbon, once white, now stained with salt. She bent closer. The ribbon bore faint initials, E.G. P. Eleanor Gresham. Palfrey. The wind lifted her skate, cold against her ankles. She rose, her face gray but calm. "So it was you," she whispered to the darkness. At that moment, footsteps crunched along the gravel behind her. "Out rather late, aren't you, Miss Marple?" The voice was calm, almost courteous. She turned slowly. Mr. Palfrey stood at the gate, his cap low over his brow, the fog swirling about him like smoke. "I might say the same, Mr. Palfrey, though I expect you more reason to walk the churchyard than I." He smiled thinly. "I suppose you've been busy meddling again. You old women always think you see more than you do." "Oh, not at all," she said. "I simply notice what others try to forget. The locket, for instance, the one you gave her. I imagine she clutched it even as she fell." His smile faltered. "I only wanted what was fair," he said quietly. "She promised me, before that fancy London man came. She said we'd go away. But then, she changed, said she couldn't bear to shame her family." "So you followed her," Miss Marple said softly, "to the cliffs. The storm was rising. You argued, and she fell." He took a step closer, the lantern's flame flickering between them. "She slipped? I swear it." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "But the sea doesn't lie, Mr. Palfrey. It sends things back. Veils, letters, ribbons." He looked down, breathing hard. "It was never meant to end that way. I thought if she was gone, no one would blame me. No one would know." Miss Marple regarded him sadly. "But the dead never leave quietly, Mr. Palfrey, not when their story remains untold." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, from the fog, a voice called, Inspector Latham's, steady and firm. "Palfrey, stay where you are." The caretaker turned, startled, his foot catching on the loose stones by the grave. His lantern swung wildly and fell. The flame hissed out in the damp grass. Later, as dawn crept pale and tired across Seacrest and Wyvern, Miss Marple sat in her room, her hands folded around a cooling cup of tea. The air smelled faintly of ashes and salt. She thought of Eleanor, the promise of youth, undone by a man's greed and a moment's madness. Outside, the tide receded, drawing back the sea's grey shroud. The gulls had returned, crying softly in the wind. Miss Marple rose, walking to the window. On the horizon, the lighthouse burned faintly through the mist, the last widow's lantern, steady and unyielding. "Love," she whispered, "is seldom pure. Lust disguises itself in devotion. Greed cloaks itself in need. But truth endures like the sea. It destroys, and yet it reveals." She drew the curtain close, her expression unreadable. And far below, the sea rolled on, endless, ancient, whispering the same confession it had always whispered, that beneath every calm surface lies something dark, waiting to be seen. Chapter 5. The Sea Remembers. The morning after the arrest dawned pale and fragile, as though the world itself were ashamed of what it had witnessed. The storm had swept through Seacrest on Wyvern and left it washed silent, its cobblestones glistening like wet bones under a weak sun. The villagers went about their business quietly that day, speaking in murmurs, as if loud words might rouse something they preferred to let sleep. Miss Marple walked alone along the cliffs. The air was heavy with salt and the faint, lingering scent of rain. Below, the tide was retreating, dragging foam and debris out to sea with long, sighing breaths. There was no triumph in her step, no satisfaction in her gaze. She had seen justice take many forms, and this one, she knew, would fade quickly beneath the steady grind of human forgetfulness. The newspapers would call it a tragedy, a tale of unrequited love gone wrong, perhaps even paint the caretaker as a man undone by passion and circumstance. They would not speak of the quieter truths, of greed disguised as devotion, of loneliness that curdled into possession. Those truths, Miss Marple thought, were never for the public to read. They belonged to the dead. The sea moved restlessly beneath her, shifting shades of pewter and gray. Somewhere out there, the remnants of the broken rowboat still drifted, the name Eleanor slowly dissolving in salt and time. She thought of the girl, young, laughing perhaps, once filled with the bright illusions of love. How easily it had all come undone. A slip of trust, a storm, a moment of fear, and the sea had claimed her. Yet, even in claiming her, it had left behind enough whispers to be heard. The veil, the letters, the ribbon, each a fragment of confession. And now, it was done. Or so it seemed. Miss Marple stopped where the cliff curved into a narrow outcropping of rock. There, half hidden in the tall grass, something caught the light. She bent slowly, her knees creaking with age, and lifted it. A brooch, gold, its claws corroded, its surface engraved with a single word, always. It must have been Eleanor's, or perhaps the sea's final offering. Either way, it felt heavy in her palm, as though it carried more than metal. She turned it over once, twice, then closed her hand around it. In her years, Miss Marple had learned that objects outlast people, but they never lose the warmth of the hands that once held them. They remembered, silently, eternally, much like the sea. She continued walking until she reached the edge where the lighthouse stood. Its great lens turned slowly, casting its pale beam across the horizon, a slow, eternal heartbeat against the endless gray. The wind tugged at her scarf, and she steadied it absently, her eyes on the line where water met sky. How long had it been since she first came here? A week? A lifetime? The days blurred when one lived amongst secrets. She felt the fatigue in her bones, the kind that comes not from exertion, but from understanding too much. Somewhere behind her, the church bell tolled, a slow, resonant note that rolled through the fog. Perhaps for Eleanor, or perhaps for the man who'd killed her. It made no difference now. The sea had them both. Miss Marple sat upon a stone, her knitting bag beside her. She did not take it out. Her fingers felt too heavy for such small comforts. Instead, she simply sat and listened. The waves spoke in long, patient tones, their rhythm timeless and knowing. The sound was neither kind nor cruel. It was simply the voice of all things that endure. She thought of St. Mary Mead, her quiet village with its gossip and roses, its kindly facades hiding sharp curiosities. So many people imagined that evil lived in grand gestures, in murders done for inheritance or vengeance. But she knew better. Evil, she had long learned, often began with something smaller, a moment of envy, a careless lie, a whisper that grew unchecked. And in Seacrest on Wyvern, it had begun with love. She smiled faintly, a sad, almost fond expression. Love, she murmured under her breath, has drowned more hearts than the sea ever could. The wind caught her words and carried them out over the water, dissolving them into mist. Evening descended slowly, as though the day were reluctant to end. The horizon burned briefly with a dull red glow, the color of fading embers, of memory. Then, one by one, the lights of the village began to flicker awake, small lanterns trembling in fog. Miss Marple rose. Her knees protested, but she ignored them. She turned one last time toward the sea. Somewhere far below, she imagined the currents weaving through rocks and sand, brushing against bones that time had almost forgotten. The sea did not judge. It simply remembered. It kept what was given, and returned what it must. And now, she thought, it had said all it wished to say. As she walked back toward the village, the fog thickened, softening every shape into shadow. The lanterns ahead glowed faintly, like will-o'-the-wisps guiding her home. When she reached her little lodging house, the windows were dark save for one, her own. She climbed the narrow stairs, set down her coat, and lit the small lamp by her bed. For a long while, she simply stood there, her reflection faint in the glass. The sea's sound drifted through the open window, distant but unceasing. She placed the brooch upon the dresser, beside her folded gloves. Its gold surface caught the lamplight, and for an instant she thought she saw the faintest shimmer of water within it, as if the sea itself still breathed there. Then the light steadied, and the illusion was gone. Miss Marple sat by the window. Outside, the waves continued their endless conversation with the shore. She rested her chin on her hand and closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw the faces, Eleanor's, pale and laughing, Palfrey's, lined and desperate, the inspector's, weary with decency, all of them adrift in the same current of human frailty. It was not justice that satisfied her, nor vengeance, only the stillness that followed truth, that quiet, sorrowful stillness where nothing more need be said. She opened her eyes again and whispered, "Rest now, child." And perhaps, somewhere beneath the black water, a spirit did. Hours later, long after the village slept, the sea rose again, gentle, rhythmic, forgiving. The waves curled up the shore, touching the rocks where the veil had once been caught, the same spot where Miss Marple had stood that morning. And as they retreated, they carried with them a small, glinting thing, a brooch of gold loosened from a windowsill by a stray gust. It fell silently into the surf, vanishing beneath the dark. The sea had remembered, and the sea, at last, had kept what was its own.